April 4th, 1991. Clinton, Missouri. While driving home, 20-year-old Angela Hammond stops off at a phone booth to call her fiancé, Rob Schaefer, and describes a suspicious-looking man in a pickup truck in the parking lot. Rob suddenly hears Angela scream and drives into town to check on her. He passes by a pickup truck and sees Angela struggling inside with an unidentified man, but after attempting a pursuit, the transmission on Rob's truck gives out. Angela is never seen again, and the identity of her abductor remains unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we will be covering an unsolved mysteries case many of you have been anxiously waiting for, the 1991 disappearance of Angela Hammond. As you probably know, to commemorate reaching our milestone of 2,000 Facebook followers, I decided to hold a poll last month, giving you folks the opportunity to vote on a selection of highly requested unsolved mysteries cases. The winner would be featured on this podcast, but the end result was a tie between the disappearances of Dub and Chance Walkerhagen, which was featured on last week's episode, and today's case. And that doesn't surprise me at all, because most Unsolved Mysteries fans consider the abduction of Angela Hammond to be one of the most terrifying stories ever featured on the show. It's a scenario you would expect to see in a horror movie, and it almost seems incredible that something like this could happen in real life. This isn't a mystery where there's much question about what actually happened, or at least there shouldn't be, but the one thing we don't know is the identity of the perpetrator, and if they might also be responsible for other unsolved crimes which took place in the area around this time period. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and shorter minisodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout-out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved abduction of Angela Hammond. Our story begins in 1991 in the small farming town of Clinton, Missouri. Our central figure is 20-year-old Angela Hammond, who usually goes by the name Angie. Angie has recently become engaged to her 18-year-old high school sweetheart Rob Schaefer, and in a major detail not mentioned in Unsolved Mysteries, Angie also happens to be 4 months pregnant with Rob's child. The couple is currently planning their future together, and Rob has aspirations of joining the military after he graduates from high school. On the evening of April 4th, Angie and Rob attended a barbecue together before she dropped Rob off at his family's home at around 10 p.m. Rob had to watch over his younger brother, but was planning to rejoin Angie later that night after his mother got home. At 11:23 p.m., Angie called Rob from a payphone in the parking lot of the Food Barn supermarket in the middle of town, which was located about 7 blocks away from the Schaefer home. Angie told him she was feeling too tired to go out with him again, so she planned to go home instead. She also expressed some concern about an older model green Ford F-150 pickup truck, which she had seen circle the block a few times, and was now coming to a stop in the parking lot near the phone booth. According to Rob, Angie told her that a filthy bearded man wearing glasses and overalls had emerged from the pickup truck and went over to use the phone booth next to hers. For reasons unknown, the man then left the booth to return to his truck and appeared to be searching for something with a flashlight. Angie thought that perhaps the other payphone might be broken, so she yelled out and asked the man if he needed to use her phone, but he replied no. Anyway, Angie and Rob continued their conversation until he suddenly heard a horrifying scream, followed by a male voice which said, "I didn't need to use the phone anyway." Rob instantly rushed out of the house, climbed into his own truck, and raced to the center of town to check on Angie. It wasn't long before he passed by a pickup which matched the description of the truck Angie had mentioned, followed by the sound of Angie screaming Rob's name. Rob turned to see Angie in the cab of the pickup, crying for help and struggling with an unidentified man. Rob immediately threw his truck into reverse and turned around to pursue the pickup truck for the next 2 miles. However, when the pickup made a sharp right turn and Rob followed suit, his truck immediately came to a dead halt. You see, when Rob abruptly threw his truck into reverse, he had seriously damaged the transmission, and now the truck could no longer function. To Rob's horror, he could only watch as the pickup sped out of town down a gravel road until it disappeared from sight, and this would turn out to be the last time anyone ever saw Angela Hammond. Anyway, Rob immediately reported Angie's abduction to the police, and since Clinton was a very small town not known for violent crime, the incident sent shockwaves throughout the community. Rob gave the police the same description of the pickup truck which Angie had provided, but also shared another key detail. The truck had a decal of what appeared to be a fish jumping out of the water, which completely covered the back window. Unfortunately, since it was dark, and the license plate was covered in dirt and rust, Rob was unable to get the number. In spite of this distinct description, a statewide search failed to turn up any trace of this pickup truck or Angie. The Missouri Highway Patrol did a computer search, and pulled up around 1,600 matches for registered vehicles which matched the truck's description, but the investigation came up empty. Now, given the incredible nature of Rob's story, the authorities had to focus on him as a potential suspect, especially since there were no other witnesses who saw Angie's abduction. The FBI even got involved in the investigation and personally questioned him. However, Rob was nothing but cooperative and passed a lie detector test. All the details of his story completely checked out, as phone records showed that Angie called Rob's house from 11:23 p.m. until 11:37. Rob's brother verified that he was at home from 10 o'clock until Angie's call prompted him to rush out of the house. The transmission on Rob's truck was seriously damaged, and even though no one actually saw Angie's abduction, 2 other witnesses did report seeing a green pickup truck parked near the phone booth that night, and it contained a bearded man matching Angie's description. So within a week of Angie's disappearance, Rob was officially cleared as a suspect. However, with no other strong leads to work with, investigators started looking into the possibility that Angie's case was connected to some other unsolved crimes which took place in Missouri during the preceding months. On the evening of January 19, 1991, 42-year-old Trudy Darby was working alone at a convenience store in the town of Max Creek, located just over 70 miles away from Clinton. Trudy was speaking with her son on the phone and expressed concern about a suspicious-looking man hanging around outside the store. Trudy's son went to the store to check on his mother, but even though it took him less than 10 minutes to arrive, Trudy had already disappeared, and $220 was missing. 2 days later, Trudy's nude body was found in the Little Niangua River 10 miles away. She had been sexually assaulted and shot twice in the head with a shotgun. Another Missouri disappearance of a female convenience store clerk took place just over a month later on February 27th, this time in the town of Nevada, which is located around 80 miles away from Max Creek and 70 miles from Clinton. This time, a 30-year-old wife and mother named Cheryl Ann Kenny was working at a convenience store and scheduled to be there until midnight, but decided to close up 2 hours early because business was very slow. However, she never returned home, and her vehicle was found in the parking lot. The store's front door was locked, and Cheryl's time card showed that she clocked out at 10 p.m. and set the alarm at 10:17. Witnesses in the area also remembered hearing a woman scream around that time period. The store's janitor had left a few minutes prior to closing, and remembered seeing a male customer in the store, even though there were no other vehicles besides Cheryl's in the parking lot. This customer has never been identified, but no one knows if he has any connection to Cheryl's disappearance. Given that Trudy, Cheryl, and Angie's disappearances all took place within 2.5 months of each other, there was speculation that they might be connected. However, in 1994, there was a resolution in Trudy Darby's case, as a pair of half-brothers named Jesse Rush and Marvin Cheney were both charged with her rape and murder and given life sentences. However, no evidence has ever linked them to the disappearances of Cheryl Ann Kenny or Angela Hammond, and Cheryl's disappearance is still unsolved. Unfortunately, even though over 26 years have passed, the identity of the man who abducted Angie remains unknown, and she has still never been found. So I guess you can say, the trail went cold. So before I delve any further into this case, the first thing I need to do is utter these 4 very important words. Rob didn't do it. You'd think I wouldn't need to hammer this point home, considering that Rob Schaefer was formally cleared as a suspect from the get-go, but you'd be surprised. Whenever this case is discussed online, you're still going to find people who disbelieve Rob's story and feel that he fabricated the whole incident with the pickup truck and was personally responsible for Angie's disappearance, which is completely and utterly ridiculous. But before I get off on a rant here, I will acknowledge that I can understand why people might be skeptical at first. Like I mentioned in the intro, the circumstances of Angie's abduction resemble a scene from a horror film. The abductor saying, "I didn't need to use the phone anyway," sounds like a cheesy one-liner from a B-movie villain, and it might seem incredible that events can unfold like this in real life. What are the odds that a guy would overhear his spouse's abduction over the phone, chase after them, but then have his vehicle break down, allowing the bad guy to get away? There's also the fact that Angie had recently become pregnant, and I guess it's possible to feel suspicious that this detail wasn't mentioned on Unsolved Mysteries. Since Rob was this popular high school football star who had big plans for the future, you could easily assume that he wanted to avoid the responsibility of being a father at such a young age, and did so by murdering his spouse and unborn child. But before you start painting Rob as this brilliant criminal mastermind, just look at the logistics of how this scene played out. Records confirm that Angie called Rob's house from that payphone from 11:23 p.m. until 11:37. After Rob's truck broke down, a motorist gave him a ride to the police station, where he officially reported Angie missing shortly after midnight. So that's a window of around 25 to 30 minutes for an 18-year-old kid to leave his house, murder Angie, dispose of her body so thoroughly that it hasn't been found in over 26 years, concoct an elaborate cover story which has never been debunked to this day, and then intentionally destroy the transmission of his truck. And he concocts this murder plot so perfectly that he's able to fool seasoned investigators, not just the local small-town police force, but the FBI as well, and they clear him as a suspect within a week. Come on! Not to mention that very few people interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries have ever come across as more heartbroken and emotionally devastated than Rob, who clearly felt immense guilt about not being able to rescue Angie. Angie's mother even appeared on the show to state that she never suspected Rob and did not blame him for what happened. Really, there's nothing else to say except that Rob Schaefer did not commit this crime. End of story. It seems clear that Rob's story is 100% true, so there really isn't any mystery about how the events in this case unfolded. The only thing we don't know is the identity of the person who abducted Angie. I think one of the reasons this case strikes such a chord with people is because the circumstances would be so different today. Remember, cell phones were not a common thing back in 1991, but nowadays, Angie would probably just use her cell phone to call or text Rob and wouldn't need to stop at a deserted payphone late at night. One detail which might strike some people as odd is why Angie would bother to use a payphone to call Rob when she was only 7 blocks away from his house. Well, it's important to note that Angie was living in a trailer home which did not have a phone. She was feeling tired, which is understandable considering she was 4 months pregnant, and just wanted to go home. But the only way she could let Rob know without actually traveling to his house was by using the payphone. It sounds like the man in the pickup truck was prowling the streets that night looking for a victim, so this might just be a case of Angie being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Given that Clinton was one of those small towns where everyone knew each other and violent crime was virtually non-existent, there was no reason for Angie to think her life might be in danger. It seems pretty likely that whoever abducted her did not live in the area and was probably just passing through. A green pickup truck with a decal in the back window of a fish jumping out of the water is such a distinct detail that I'm sure someone would have been able to pick out a suspect with a matching vehicle if he lived there. Since no trucks matching that description were ever found, I would not be surprised if the suspect got rid of the truck shortly after the abduction, or at the very least, got rid of the decal. Even though there were apparently a few unconfirmed sightings of Angie in the months following her disappearance, those eyewitnesses were probably mistaken. Sadly, I think it's pretty much a given that Angie was murdered on the very same night she was abducted. So let's start looking at possible suspects. Well, since they took place within the same 100-mile radius of Missouri, investigators initially attempted to link Angie's case with the murder of Trudy Darby and the disappearance of Cheryl Ann Kenny, but I'm inclined to think they're not connected. Of course, Trudy Darby's case is now solved, and her 2 killers are currently incarcerated, but it doesn't sound like they found anything to indicate that either Jesse Rush or Marvin Chaney might be responsible for Angie's abduction, or Cheryl's disappearance for that matter. Cheryl Ann Kenny has still never been found, and there really isn't a whole lot of information out there about her case, but there is some. The biggest lead was this male customer who was seen inside the convenience store shortly before closing. However, since Cheryl set the alarm and locked the door, it's very unlikely this man would have been inside the store after closing, so if he was responsible, he probably had to hang around outside for about 20 minutes, and then abducted Cheryl after she exited. The store custodian also said there were no other vehicles in the parking lot while this man was there, but it wasn't unusual for customers to walk to the store since there were several hotels nearby. Since Cheryl's car was left behind, it's possible this customer is nothing more than a red herring. Interestingly enough, I found a news report about this case on YouTube from 2011, and it looks like Cheryl's 2 children believe that her husband at the time was responsible for her disappearance. This man is not their biological father, and he denies these allegations. There really isn't enough information out there for me to speculate about this, but if these allegations were true, and Cheryl's husband was the perpetrator, then I'd say that firmly rules out the possibility of this case being connected to Angela Hammond's disappearance. So until I see evidence suggesting otherwise, I'm going to assume these cases aren't linked. Anyway, there are 2 notorious criminals who are often mentioned as potential suspects in Angela's abduction. One of them is serial killer Kenneth McDuff, who was responsible for another case featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the abduction and subsequent murder of Colleen Reed from an Austin, Texas car wash in December of 1991. He is responsible for the murders of at least 9 victims, and possibly more. McDuff was apprehended in May of 1992 and executed 6.5 years later. Quite frankly, I just don't see why McDuff is considered a strong suspect here. If you look at photographs of McDuff, he doesn't really bear a resemblance to the bearded man Angie described. Now, Alva Hank Worley, who was McDuff's accomplice in the Colleen Reed abduction and is currently serving a 40-year sentence, he is a dirty-looking bearded man, but I see no indication that he's ever been considered a suspect in Angie's disappearance. But in regards to Kenneth McDuff, his crimes took place in Texas. It's true that McDuff was living under an assumed name in Kansas City at the time he was apprehended, but I don't see anything that places him in Missouri in April of 1991. So I really have my doubts that McDuff was responsible for this crime, but the next guy I'm going to talk about is a fairly interesting suspect. His name is Larry Dwayne Hall, and he's currently serving a life sentence for the 1993 kidnapping and subsequent death of 15-year-old Jessica Roach. Oddly, even though Hall confessed to killing her, he could not be charged with her actual murder since police couldn't pinpoint where she was killed. But some people believe Hall might be a full-fledged serial killer who has taken the lives of as many as 40 victims. Since his incarceration, Hall has confessed to the murders of at least 2 other missing young women, but has recanted one of these confessions, and no bodies have ever been found, so officially, no other murders have ever been tied to him. Now, at one point, Hall corresponded with Christopher Hawley Martin, an author who wrote a book about him, and told him he had buried 5 female victims in Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. Hall claimed that 3 of the victims were from Springfield, and the 2 others were from small towns he couldn't remember the names of. Well, of course, this made Hall a potential suspect in the Springfield 3 disappearance, which might be the most famous missing persons case in the history of Missouri. In case you're not familiar with it, on June 7, 1992, 3 women, Cheryl Levitt, her daughter Stacy McCall, and Stacy's friend Susie Streeter, Hall vanished without explanation from their home in the middle of the night in Springfield, which is about 90 miles away from Clinton. That case is still unsolved, and Hall has never been officially linked to it, but you can't help but wonder if one of the other two victims he was referring to might be Angela Hammond. You see, even though he hailed from Indiana, Hall worked with a traveling Civil War reenactment group and often frequented Missouri. Because of this, Hall had old-school Civil War-style mutton chops, and when you look at his mugshot, he does kind of match the description of the filthy bearded man Angie described. Now, a key difference is that Hall always drove a van, and there was no indication he ever drove a pickup truck. But during an interview, Christopher Hawley Martin claimed that he spoke to a detective from Clinton who told him they had now discounted the pickup truck theory in Angie's case. Okay, I can find no other source which corroborates this, and all indications are that Angie's abductor drove a pickup truck, so I'm not quite sure what he's talking about. Anyway, while it's certainly possible Hall was responsible for Angela's disappearance, there's no evidence to link him. And as you probably know, convicted murderers often have a tendency to confess to crimes they did not commit. So it would not surprise me if that's exactly what Hall was doing, especially since he's already recanted one confession. However, out of all the suspects I mentioned here, I'd say that Larry Dwayne Hall is easily the most credible. If he did murder Angie, then at least we can take comfort in knowing that he'll be locked up for the rest of his life. But it would be nice to get some conclusive evidence to tie him to Angie's disappearance, so it can be officially solved. Her family definitely needs some closure after all this time, not to mention that pinning this crime on the real perpetrator would finally remove the cloud of suspicion from Rob Schaefer for good, as he's had to live with a terrible burden all these years, and deserves to see a resolution. So if you have any information about the unsolved disappearance of Angela Hammond, please contact the Clinton Police Department at 660-885-5561. That's 660-885-5561. And if you happen to have any info on the unsolved disappearance of Cheryl Ann Kenny, you can contact the Nevada Police Department at 417-448-2710. That's 417-448-2710. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Just wanted to thank all my supporters from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast, and Vince Nitro, who is responsible for the eerie music you hear on every episode. We also have a new donor this week named Lewis, who has gone a step further and signed up for recurring monthly donations, so thank you very much, Lewis. And we have a special announcement to make. The Trail Went Cold is finally going to be starting its very own Facebook discussion group. We already have a main Facebook page, but we figured we should start our own private group in which our listeners can discuss the podcast, our featured cases, true crime, or anything you want in depth. And I'll definitely be present in the group to participate in the discussions whenever I can. This will be a private, closed group, so all of your discussions will be invisible to the outside world. All you have to do is request to join, and we'll approve your entrance. This group should be set up by the evening of Wednesday, August 9th, so keep an eye out on our social media for an announcement. And within the next few days, we're also going to be announcing a very special contest for our listeners, so stay tuned. So before we close things out, I just want to play some promos I've recently received for two other podcasts, This Week in True Crime History and Podcast 1289. Check them out.
Hello, fellow true crime fans. My name is Joel Micah Harris. I host the podcast This Week in True Crime History, which takes a look at the horrific real events of years past on the week of their anniversary. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Until then, stay safe.
In the spring of 2016, 3 humans from the planet Earth, Dan.
You remember that one time I convinced you that me and my friend discovered a body?
Mike.
The money's in the bathroom on the sink.
And Jesse.
You never seen my documentary, Predator?
Were abducted by aliens from the planet Kerbert Suslation. In order to study their culture, these visitors forced their abductees to discuss a wide range of topics, covering everything from the paranormal.
It's a fucking wicked, spooky, haunting kid.
True crime.
And after they were all dead, I took some coal oil, poured it over the bodies, and then set fire with a match.
Oh my god, is she alright?
Cryptozoology.
A chupacabra ate his chickens.
Like his KFC?
Conspiracy theories.
Stephen King shot John Lennon in the back 5 times.
He was stealing all my Mars bars.
And everything in between.
Yeah, I be hanging out with Werner Herzog. We watched The Cure of the Wrath of Khan together, yeah? Yeah!
Join this trio, along with their rotating cast of special guests, as they go in search of the unknown on Podcast 1289. Available on iTunes. Follow them on Twitter at Podcast1289. Is that all you need me to say? Because I've got to go take a shit.
Dude, this is live.
What?
And of course, a big thanks to everyone who voted in our Facebook poll. It was great seeing this poll end in a tie, and I'm looking forward to holding another poll like this sometime soon. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.